She thought he only needed a housekeeper. A blind man, alone on a distant farm, who couldn't see the way her hands shook, or how the townspeople used to laugh behind her back. But the night he stood in the doorway, holding a ring and whispering, "You feel like spring," everything she believed about herself shattered. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Mabel Whitmore knew how to disappear without ever leaving the room. It was a skill honed over years, not out of shyness, but necessity. In a town like Clover Bend, a woman learned quickly that if she wasn't beautiful, she'd better be useful. So Mabel poured herself into usefulness, into stacked cans, dusted shelves, neatly tied paper parcels, into the quiet rhythm of things done right and never praised. Her hands were steady and quick. Her eyes rarely met others. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, her words came soft, careful, like she was borrowing space that wasn't really hers. Her aunt, Edna, ran the general store with the vigor of someone who thrived on routine and rumors. She was the kind of woman who wore her aprons like armor and handed out gossip with gumdrops. Edna didn't mean to be cruel, not exactly, but she'd often glance at Mabel like she was a puzzle piece that never quite fit. "Smile more," she'd say while ringing up flour. "It won't fix your face, but it might confuse folks long enough." Mabel never answered. She just nodded and went back to arranging the pickle jars by brand and brine. Outside, the townsfolk passed like clockwork shadows. Mrs. Jacobs with her high-heeled spite, old Mr. Dillard spitting tobacco and judgment, the Harper twins giggling behind lace gloves. They all saw Mabel, but never saw her. She was a fixture, like the chipped bell above the door or the faded Clover Bend mercantile sign swinging in the breeze. But late at night, when the store was dark and the wind rustled through the cottonwoods, Mabel would sit by the back window with a cup of weak tea and stare out at the stars. She didn't cry. Not anymore. But there was an ache inside her, quiet and constant, like the creak of an old rocking chair. Not for romance exactly, not even for company, just for witness, to be seen without flinching, heard without hurry. So when that letter arrived, plain envelope, smeared ink, nothing special at first glance, something stirred. Not in the room, in her. She read the ad once, then again, and again. By the fourth time, her hands were trembling. It wasn't love, it wasn't rescue, but it was a door, and Mabel Whitmore, for the first time in her life, reached for the handle. The Blackwood homestead looked like something time had forgotten, but chosen not to ruin. The house, though weather-worn, stood solid on a rise of land tucked into the cradle of the valley. Ivy curled up the posts like it had secrets to keep. The orchard stretched behind it in neat, stubborn rows, apricot and apple trees bowing in the wind like old men in prayer. The coach didn't linger. As soon as Mabel stepped down, the driver tipped his hat and vanished in a cloud of dust, leaving her alone with the silence and him. Silas Blackwood stood on the porch like he had been carved there, a fixture of wood and wind and will. His frame was broad but not bulky, strong the way trees are strong. His boots were worn. His jaw carried a day's stubble. His eyes were the color of storm-tossed glass, pale, unseeing, but his head turned when she approached, like her presence drew lines in the air he could follow. "You the one who came to help?" he asked, his voice like gravel smoothed by time. Mabel cleared her throat. "Yes, sir. Mabel Whitmore." He nodded once, then turned. No greeting, no pleasantries. The door creaked open. She stepped inside. The house was plain, bare floors, clean hearth, shelves lined with jars she could already tell were alphabetized by memory, not sight. It smelled of cedar and soap and earth. No clutter, no dust, no warmth. She found her room upstairs. Small, but not mean. The window opened toward the orchard. The bed creaked. The quilt was stitched with fading blues and golds, worn at the corners. For the first few days, they moved like two moons in orbit. She rose early, cooked eggs and fried potatoes, left them on the table, and didn't wait to see if he ate them. She washed the linens. She swept the barn. The goats got out twice. She fixed the fence with twine and muttered curses under her breath when a nail bent sideways. Silas never commented, but she noticed. The next day, better nails appeared on the shelf. He knew the land, the way some men knew Scripture. He walked without hesitation, his cane barely touching the dirt, fingers brushing against fences, vines, bark, reading the world in texture. And though he never called her name again, he never missed a cup of tea, warm on the porch by sundown. Then came the moment by the well. She slipped. Rain had slicked the stones. The bucket swung wild, rope jerking in her hand. Her foot twisted, her balance vanished. And before the ground could meet her, his hand was there. Not fumbling, not reaching. Just there, steady. Like he'd known she would fall. "You all right?" he asked, his voice just above a whisper. She stared at him, heartbeat too loud in her ears. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." And in the shadow between them, his lips curved, not wide, not sure, but enough. A crack in the stone, a light in the dark. Autumn settled over the Blackwood homestead like a whispered promise, not abrupt, but inevitable. The mornings turned crisper, and the apples on the trees hung heavy and red like secrets waiting to drop. The fields no longer buzzed with summer urgency. Instead, there was a hush. A kind of pause before the cold. And in that quiet, something else began to bloom. Mabel had started leaving wildflowers on the porch railing. Not bouquets, just small gestures. A sprig of goldenrod, a single daisy, wild mint in a jelly jar. She never said why, and Silas never asked. But she noticed he lingered on the porch longer each morning, his hand occasionally grazing the rim of the jar, resting there as if memorizing the shape of what he couldn't see. They moved around each other in gentle patterns now. No longer strangers, not yet something else. In the golden light of dusk, she'd sit near the hearth and read aloud. Old farm almanacs, passages from tattered novels left behind in a crate, even weather reports from the paper. Silas would work nearby, sanding wood or oiling hinges, never interrupting. She thought he wasn't listening. Until one night, his voice broke the silence. "You have a kind voice." Startled, she dropped the book, heart jumping in her chest like a startled rabbit. The compliment was soft, but it landed hard. Not because of what was said, but because of who had said it. A man who never wasted words. A man who didn't see her, but somehow noticed everything. From that night on, she read to him as if it were a shared ritual. They spoke more, nothing dramatic, just threads of daily life that stitched their silence together. She told him how she burned the bread once as a girl and cried like it was a funeral. He told her how the land smelled different just before rain. One night she laughed, really laughed, unguarded and sudden, and Silas turned toward her like the sound itself had weight and color. She didn't know it then, but he would remember that sound more clearly than any voice. Still, Mabel didn't let herself dream. One morning, catching her reflection in the streaked mirror above the wash basin, she winced. Her features looked as uneven as the things they'd once said, the nose too long, the chin too sharp. "Too ugly to marry," the words whispered back from somewhere in her memory, a voice she hadn't silenced yet. And then, days later, in the orchard with the wind tugging at her shawl, Silas said it, unprovoked, uncalculated. "You smell like rosemary and bread. I can feel when you smile. The room warms up. I can't see you, Mabel, but I know what beauty feels like. And you feel like spring." The world seemed to tilt. She stood rooted, hands still, throat tight with something that might have been tears or hope, or both. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. That night, after supper and firewood and silence, she stayed in the chair beside him, her knitting untouched in her lap long after the fire had burned to embers. Winter arrived not with drama, but with dignity. The hills wore white like a blessing, not a burden, and the trees stood bare yet proud, limbs etched against pale skies. Inside the house, everything slowed. The floorboards creaked more gently. The stove breathed steady warmth. And Mabel stitched in the corner, not for utility, but for memory. The quilt grew under her hands, square by square, like a patchwork of belonging. She didn't measure with rulers or patterns. She measured with moments. The tartan scrap from the rag she dropped into the stew the night Silas asked for seconds. The corner of a pillowcase from the room she once called guest, and now simply called home. A faded patch of blue, from the dress she wore when he compared her to spring, rested at the center, a silent heartbeat. She finished it in silence and left it folded on his bed. No note, no fanfare. That evening, the wind clattered against the shutters, but the kitchen was warm. Mabel stood at the table, dusting her hands with flour, humming a tune her mother once sang, a melody with no name, just comfort. She didn't hear him enter. She only noticed when the silence shifted. "I want you to stay," Silas said. She froze, her hand mid-reach for the rolling pin, turned slowly. He stood across from her, not uncertain, not rehearsed, just waiting. "Not just as a housekeeper," he added, his voice low but clear. "As what you are, the only light I've known in years." Mabel's throat tightened. Her hands trembled in the flour. I'm not what men dream of," she whispered. "They used to say—" But he stepped forward, gently, not touching her, just close enough that she felt steadied. "I'm not most men," he said, "and you're not most women." Then, from his coat pocket, worn, frayed at the edge, he pulled a small ring. No diamond, no polish, just a band of gold, quiet and steady. "Will you stay, Mabel?" She looked at him, not the eyes clouded by time, but the man beyond them. The man who listened when she read, who remembered her laugh, who felt her smile, who waited without asking and loved without seeing. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed her flour-dusted hand over his, curled her fingers around the ring like it was the most precious thing she'd ever been offered. Then, in the golden hush of the kitchen, beneath beams that had watched lives come and go, under a lamplight that softened every scar, she nodded. Not because she was afraid of being alone, but because at last someone had looked at her, truly looked, and chosen to stay. And this time she chose to stay too.